Hello and welcome to another video. I hope you're all doing well. Today's video is a journal with me. In fact, it's part of a new series that I'm going to call Journal and Chat. So it's part journal with me. That's the video clip you're seeing. Specifically, I'm working in my commonplace book today. And then in the voiceover, I'm going to chat with you about a very fun topic, one that I hope a lot of you will find interesting. And that is just everything to do with the practice of commonplacing. What it is, why you should do it, its history, my personal history with it, and I'll talk a bit about what I was commonplacing in this video and my process for doing that. If you're not interested in any of that rambling, that is completely fine. Feel free to mute me and treat this just as a journaling body double video. You can pop your own music on, choose some peaceful silence over my dulcet tones, whatever you want, I will not be offended. Anyway, without further ado, let me blabber about commonplacing because I'm not joking. I have written 3,600 plus words of notes about this. We're going to be here for a while, so I'd better get started. First of all, I thought I would talk a bit about what a commonplace book actually is and what commonplacing is for anyone who might not be familiar with it. I mean, if you're on this channel, you probably are at least a little bit, but you never know. So in its most basic classic form, a commonplace book is a blank notebook that a person uses to transcribe written material that they want to collect. To begin with, in history, that was mostly proverbs, those famous old sayings that tend to impart wisdom of one sort or another. But people also write, poems that they love, interesting facts that they want to remember, excerpts from books, any kind of copied text that they want to preserve and remember. A person might also include their own personal writings in a commonplace book, essays they've written, smaller bits of prose, outlines of pieces they want to write, or little snippets of beautiful phrasing that they want to remember. They might include recipes, prayers or religious musings, interesting phrases, basically any kind of written information that you can think of. However, one thing that classical commonplace books didn't typically include was journaling or diary writing. That seems to have been seen as a different practice for a different notebook. And I'm all for collecting multiple notebooks. Just saying. Anyway, some people keep commonplace books on just one topic. Others commonplace about multiple topics with different headings for each or different categorization systems. And some people, and by some people I mean me, commonplace about multiple topics without clear headings all the time or categorization because we just love chaos, basically. I love a notebook filled with chaos. I have even tried to categorize things in the past, which I'll talk about later, and given up because turns out I just like chaos. I don't know what that says about me as a person. But let's move back to general information about commonplacing and out of my brain. In the modern era, commonplacing has really expanded to include other information keeping, I guess due to the huge expansion in the types of content we have available to us these days, and also due to technological advances that help with collecting information. People often stick photographs or printed pictures in their books of maybe art they love, interesting artifacts, otherwise intriguing pictures, special to them images, personal pictures. And people also print out pieces of text and stick them into the book instead of copying them out. Another change in the modern era is that some people do choose to incorporate journal-style entries into their books. For example, Megan Rhiannon does this. I also do it. I guess for me it's just nice to have the one book for all long-form writing. It just keeps things simpler and more compact. Some people have even gone digital. Instead of keeping their commonplace book in an actual physical book, they use digital information gathering apps like Notion or Evernote. Or they might have a combination of both if that floats their boat. A combination of written commonplace and digital commonplace. There really are just so many options with commonplacing, and that's one of the things that makes it really great, to me at least. You can really tailor the practice to what you want and what you find fulfilling and interesting. So that's a basic introduction to the practice. Now I'm going to answer a common question I get from people who aren't really in the notebook journaling space, which is, why bother? Isn't that a lot of effort? And yeah, it is a bit of effort, but it's fun, first of all. And there are a lot of, in my opinion, very good reasons to commonplace. The first is that it's great for memory, because goodness knows, our brains cannot keep up with the absolute bombardment of information that the modern world just foists upon us at all times. There's just no hope of us remembering everything we come across that we think is cool. So yeah, your commonplace book can be a helping hand, a place to refer back to when you want to remember things. Commonplacing can also be a really enriching creative practice. Note that it doesn't actually have to be. A commonplace book doesn't have to be, aesthetically pleasing, highly decorated, or even decorated at all. Like, it can be a rough and purely functional notebook in which you write stuff down. But if you are creatively inclined, it can be so satisfying to find ways to decorate your commonplace book, to find images that complement whatever you're writing about. And yeah, it's just really, really fun, in my opinion. It's a fun way to incorporate lots of different creative practices all in one book. For me, that's writing, occasionally doodling, calligraphy, which I'm not that good at if I'm being honest, but I enjoy it, so who cares? And yeah, it's just a really nice work of art that you produce. But again, to underscore, it doesn't have to be a work of art. It can be whatever you want it to be. So please don't be put off commonplacing if you're not someone who likes to decorate things, because you truly do not need to. It's optional. Finally, and this might just be personal to me, but I'm going to say it anyway, I find commonplacing really relaxing. It's really soothing to me and almost a form of meditation, like it's meditative. I really find it calming to sit and fill my book's pages with whatever I've collected that day or that week or even that month if I haven't been keeping up with it, which is the case right now. There's something extremely satisfying as well about filling a commonplace notebook and flipping through to see pages and pages of exciting collected stuff. Or at least I imagine it would be satisfying. I've actually never managed to fill a commonplace book because I keep switching systems, and that is on me. But one day I'm sure I will get to that point finally where I can do a full flip through of a finished book. Alright, so hopefully now you're convinced that you should be commonplacing. If you're not, that's fine. But as I say, I think it's cool. So let's move on to something else that I think is cool, and that is the history of commonplacing. Before I get into this little history section, a couple of things to say. One is, I love history. It's one of my oldest and strongest autistic special interests. I will find any excuse I can to talk about history, so this probably won't be the last time I blabber about it on this channel. Second, as a trained historian, I did my bachelor's and master's in history. I get extreme anxiety if I don't properly cite my sources, so I'll be linking the sources I used in my research in the description of this video. Third, full disclosure, one of those sources is Wikipedia, and it goes against everything I learned at school and university about how you should never cite Wikipedia as a source because it's not reliable, blah, blah, blah. But in my defense, right, the page on commonplacing is really thorough, interesting, and well backed up with citations. So I'm going to say that it's completely reasonable to cite it in this case. Finally, a note that this history of commonplacing is incomplete. People have written entire books on this, and I don't have the time or space to cover absolutely everything without this turning into an hours long video. So I'm going to cover just the broad strokes. Right, let's dive in. At the beginning, commonplace books have their roots in the truly ancient past, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where the learned men of the time would have books where they compiled grammar rules, idioms and sayings, just their general musings and observations. I've seen it argued that the Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius had a commonplace book. And if it's good enough for a Roman emperor, it's good enough for me. So, started in the ancient world. Then the commonplacing tradition kind of continued into the medieval era, which is my era that I specialised in. I love it. As was the case with a lot of writing at this time, the commonplace books of the medieval era had quite a theological slant a lot of the time. It was, the churchmen of the day compiling biblical quotes and excerpts from other approved theological works in books that they called florilegia, or collections of flowers, which I think is really lovely, actually. You know, we're little gardeners pruning little flowers of knowledge, which we want to press and keep in our notebooks for another day. I do quite like that. So yeah, medieval churchmen, they were commonplacing to their heart's content. But it was really in the early modern period that commonplacing really exploded as a practice. For reference, the early modern period is basically from around the mid-15th century to the late 18th, 19th century. There's not really a set consensus among historians about this, but yeah, that's the general ballpark. In this era, commonplacing became really popular at universities, and it was actually taught at some universities as an art, which I would have so taken a class on commonplacing, just saying. And because it was taught at universities, a lot of the leading thinkers, writers, and theologians of the day had their own commonplace books. Some of the most famous people of this time who kept a commonplace book include John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, who apparently referenced nearly 100 different authors in his book, which is super impressive. We actually still have his book in the British Library, which is also really cool. The genius Scottish poet Robert Burns also kept a commonplace book, and I believe it was actually published. I don't know if you can still get it or if it's out of print, but I'm sure it was published at one point. And the philosopher John Locke also had a commonplace book, and he was really deep into the practice. He actually wrote either a book or a pamphlet about his personal commonplacing technique and like the index system he used, which I think is really cool. And this was the time that people really started taking commonplacing seriously as a practice, and you know, they had indexing systems. They cared about this stuff. And side note, I bet John Locke would have made a YouTube commonplace book tour were he alive today. Or at least I like to think he would, because that's a hilarious mental image. All that aside, at this time, people really started collecting huge amounts of information and really varied types of material in these books. Quotes, songs, prayers, maths problems, book summaries, you name it, they copied it down. They really went for it at this stage, and I, for one, admire them for it, because they really created the practice of commonplacing as we know it today. So going forward into the modern era, there were fewer cases of famous commonplaces, I guess because, you know, quite a lot of big global stuff happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's possible that people just had other things on their minds at this time. That's not to say it disappeared as a practice. Some people did keep it up, including writers like Virginia Woolf. I think people tend to refer to her notebooks as her diaries or journals, but they do incorporate some commonplacing elements. Like, she wrote a lot about the books that she read. Bizarrely, though, another 20th century commonplacer was US President Ronald Reagan. That was an unexpected name that came up while I was researching this, but fair play to him for that. So yeah, commonplacing continued, but maybe at a lower profile. And then we reached the 21st century, and I would argue that commonplacing is again becoming more popular as a practice. I think that's probably due to the influence of some popular creators in, you know, the journaling and StudyTube and online creator communities, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And it's also, as I've mentioned, morphing into this practice that people sometimes do digitally on apps rather than in a notebook. So yeah, that brings us up to today. But before I move on from this history section, I'm going to throw in some random information that I just felt compelled to share, which is that there is also a history of commonplacing in fiction. Fictional characters have kept commonplace books. One really famous example is Sherlock Holmes in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. For example, in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, there's a quote where Watson observes, "Then Sherlock Holmes pulled down from the shelf one of the ponderous commonplace books in which he placed his cuttings." There's also a quote in The Return of Sherlock Holmes, where Holmes stretched out his hand and took down letter S of his commonplace book, which kind of implies that he has this entire catalogued collection of commonplace books that he keeps in alphabetical order, which sounds like the dream. It's not just Sherlock Holmes, though. A more modern example of fictional commonplacing comes in the show Supernatural. The character John Winchester has a notebook that I would consider a commonplace book. He kind of compiles a lot of information he's gathered about various supernatural entities, his experiences hunting them, and just general hunting technique. Full disclosure, I have not actually watched all or even much of Supernatural because it's just too long. There are so many seasons and every season has so many episodes, and I just don't think I could ever catch up. I know it's finished now, but I don't know if I could actually sit through that many hours of TV. Maybe that says a lot about my attention span, but I just couldn't do it. That said, I've seen enough posts on Tumblr about Supernatural that I feel like I have a firm grasp of the main characters, and I kind of know the general vibe of the show. And I also know a lot about the absolute nonsense surrounding whether Destiel is canon or not. I like to consider that it is, just saying. But yeah, I also know enough about the show to know that John Winchester has a commonplace book. So there you have it. These are not the only examples of fictional commonplace books, but I'm already at 20 minutes odd of this recording, so I'm going to move swiftly on. We're going to talk about my personal history of commonplacing, segueing nicely from, general history to personal history. My commonplacing began back in 2019 when I started reading for fun again, post-university. It was actually a good couple of years since I'd graduated university at that point, but I had to read so much that I was just burned out on the entire concept of reading for years. I was reading bits here and there, but not systematically or regularly by any means, until, as I say, 2019, when I got back into it. I found myself reading a lot of quotes and excerpts that resonated with me, and I decided to record them, write them down, but I did this in a really haphazard way. I would write stuff on scrap pieces of paper that I would then lose, because of course I would. I would maybe write bits in my daily diary. I would add things to the notes app on my phone. Yeah, everything was just in different places, and it got annoying and frustrating because I could never actually find the information that I had saved. And I feel like, if you're saving it for a reason, you want to be able to access it again in the future. So I started looking online for kind of information storage systems, and I came across a video by Robin Walden called How to Keep a Commonplace Book. I will link that specific video in the description, with the caveat that this is an older video of his, and he's actually done updated videos about his commonplace book in the years since. So you might want to watch those more recent ones. Anyway, Robin explained the practice of commonplacing super simply in that video, and I was hooked. He also talked about how he used the app Evernote for his commonplacing at that time. And that really intrigued me because at that time I was trying to be a bit more minimalist about how many physical possessions I had. I wanted to switch to being digital for at least some of my writing. So following in Robin's footsteps, I started a commonplace book on Evernote. Now, what I learned after a few months of using Evernote is that while I really loved the concept of collecting information in one place, I didn't like doing it on the app. I really just like the practice of writing things out by hand, as it turns out. And that is no criticism of Evernote. It worked really well for what I wanted it to do. It just turns out that I'm a physical writer. As I mentioned earlier, I find the act of writing really soothing. So I felt I was missing out on that by keeping things digital. So in, I think, around early 2020 sometime, I switched to a physical commonplace book. This was just a simple lined notebook, no frills, and no decoration inside either. It literally was just me writing out information that resonated with me. And again, for the most part, this was great. It scratched my itch of wanting to write things out by hand, and I found it more convenient to have a physical notebook in some ways because I actively try not to spend too much time on technology, she says while uploading a YouTube video. Anyway, yeah, having a physical book instead of something phone-based like an app was great for me in that sense. And yeah, I used this lined notebook system for a good chunk of time. But I found this approach to commonplacing just a little bit dull. I was kind of craving the feeling of mixing functionality with aesthetically pleasing pages. Basically, I wanted to decorate. That's it. That's what I'm trying to say here. I just wanted to decorate things. And that meant that around late 2020, early 2021 time, I was mulling over trying to find a new system that could incorporate some decorative elements in it. However, unfortunately, I got quite unwell in 2021, Mentally, I mean, because of pandemic-related stress and life-related stress. And I gave up commonplacing entirely for a good long while. Because at that time, I was just barely functioning on a day-to-day basis. So there was absolutely no hope of me keeping up any kind of commonplacing practice. Like it just wasn't going to happen. So I set my notebooks aside and I really focused my energy on just healing and getting better from the anxiety that had made my life a nightmare at that time. I'm happy to say that I did indeed heal and got much, much better. And by late 2021, I was again getting the itch to start commonplacing and reading again. Around that time, I came across one of Ali Abdaal's videos about the app Notion, which many people use as like a digital planning and note-taking repository. One of the big draws of Notion is that it's super customizable and you can make it really aesthetically pleasing by adding in images and icons and different fonts and colours. And yeah, that really sparked something in me. I know I said previously that I realised that I was a physical commonplacer, like I like writing by hand, and that was still true. But at the time, I was doing a lot of writing by hand in my long-form journal, and I felt that that kind of fulfilled that itch for me, and I was willing to give digital commonplacing a try again. So I did. But this is becoming a common theme. Something still didn't feel quite right for me with that system. One thing that kind of annoyed me about it is that it's really difficult, or at least at the time, it was really difficult to get Notion to work well offline. It was very much an online app, and that was inconvenient if I was not anywhere where I had access to the internet, or if I didn't want to use my mobile data when I was out. You know, it was just a bit annoying having to consider like, oh, I've got to be connected to the Wi-Fi to be able to do this. And on top of that, I was going through another phase at that time of trying to get even less screen time. This has just been a constant thing for me, trying to minimize screen time as much as possible over the years, because I find that it helps my sleep. I know they say not to use a screen just before bed, but I find even if I use screens a lot in the hours before bed, I struggle to sleep. So yeah, I was becoming a bit uncomfortable with the idea that my commonplace book was on a phone or on a computer, because I wanted to use those things less. What finally pushed me to abandon Notion and go back to handwritten commonplacing in a notebook was YouTube randomly recommending me one of Megan Rhiannon's videos in late 2022. It was one in which she featured her commonplace book pretty heavily. Again, her channel will be linked in the description because it's amazing. But yeah, I was just immediately hooked by the style of commonplacing that Megan has designed. Kind of a mix of handwritten notes and aesthetically pleasing images, stickers, doodles. It basically just combined everything I was looking for: function, decoration, and an analog system. So I bought myself an A5 dot grid notebook and decided to start a mixed functional and decorative system. And I fell in love. I've been using my own version of Megan's system ever since. It's a little streamlined compared to what Megan does. For one, I don't personally use any categorization system in my commonplace book. Megan quite famously uses a coloured dot categorization system, like dot stickers of different colours for different topics. But I didn't get along with that when I tried it, I think because I could never remember what topic each colour corresponded to. So it didn't actually help me to have it there. I'd just get annoyed with myself that I couldn't remember. So I stopped doing that. And I also don't use margins in my books, which Megan does. I just use the full space of the page. So yeah, that's my commonplacing journey so far. To be honest, I can't see my system changing anytime soon from what it currently is. I really love it, and I can't find any flaws in it or any things that I find a bit annoying. I think it is just perfect for me. But never say never, I guess. I thought all the other systems I tried would be perfect for me. And yet, here we are. I'm gonna close up this video by talking a bit about what I've been doing in the video clip. I've been commonplacing, as I mentioned. But yeah, let's get a bit more specific than that, I guess. In this particular clip, I was adding some quotes and Tumblr posts to my commonplace book, which is something I do pretty regularly. I really like to collect and keep quotes and posts that fit a few themes. One is things that inspire me or reassure me, particularly when I'm going through a rough patch. It's nice to have things to flick back and look at that are going to make me feel a bit better and inspire me to keep going. I also have quotes that exactly describe something that I've experienced or am going through, because sometimes it's nice to just feel seen in that way. There are some quotes in here that call me out for something that I either need to do or need to stop doing. I guess I'd class these as like tough love quotes. And finally, sometimes I copy stuff out just because it makes me laugh, either because it's intended to be funny or because it's so absurd that it is unintentionally funny. In terms of decoration on these pages, I always do a bit of decoration on every page, whether that's stickers or printed out photos or washi tape. Sometimes that decoration is related to what I'm writing about, but a lot of the time it's not. It's just whatever decoration style I'm vibing with in that moment. So for example, in this particular set of pages, it's a bit of both actually. The planner stickers on the left-hand page from Stick with Kate are relevant to the general idea of commonplacing and writing in notebooks. But on the right-hand page, it's just cozy autumn stickers from Bartista Shop on Etsy. And those are more just because I'm enjoying the fact it's autumn. They don't really relate to what I'm writing about. All right, that is it. I've been talking for a long while now. My throat is starting to hurt a bit, so I think it's time to bring this video to a close. I really hope you've all enjoyed it. If you're a commonplacing veteran, I'd love to hear how you got into it and what your personal system is. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing because it helps me out a lot. And yeah, thank you all for making it to the end.